Russia on the brink of recession. That's the startling message that Russia's Minister for Economic Development Maxim Reshetnikov delivered toward the end of June. Reshetnikov's message hides a veiled plea to Russian President Vladimir Putin: end the war now, or Russia will suffer even more. Things are so bad that Russia's central bank is begging Putin to pull out of Ukraine. The question now is whether Putin will listen, or if he's so far gone that nothing his people can say can influence the decisions he makes. Reshetnikov's message came during Russia's annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, and the minister offered plenty of reasoning for his stark warning. The numbers indicate cooling, but all our numbers are like a rearview mirror, Reshetnikov told attendees. Judging by the way businesses currently feel and the indicators, we are already, it seems to me, on the brink of going into a recession. And he's not the only one who's delivering warnings to Putin. Also at the forum was Russia's central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, who pointed out that Russia's economic woes are coming because it's running out of resources. We grew for 2 years at a fairly high pace because unused resources were activated. We need to understand that many of those resources have truly been exhausted, she said. Nabiullina isn't solely talking about material resources here. She's also implying that Russia is dealing with a labor shortage, meaning its human resources are starting to run out as Putin sends more and more of the country's people to Ukraine. And she has a point. In May, Russia's unemployment rate hit a new low of 2.2%. While that may seem like good news on the surface, as fewer unemployed people means most in Russia are earning a wage, it hides a problem that Putin's war has created. There aren't enough people in Russia to fill the jobs being advertised by its more consumer-focused industries. The situation has gotten so bad for Russia, the Kyiv Post reported on June 23rd, that it's being forced to hire thousands of workers from China, Turkey, and India to overcome its labor shortages. In 2024 alone, 47,000 foreign workers arrived in Russia, suggesting that the country is having trouble filling available positions due to its lack of labor resources. The message is clear. Russia faces a difficult 2026 unless Putin pulls out of Ukraine and focuses on fixing the country's economy. At least the message seemed to be clear. In the wake of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, contradictory messages have started coming out of Russia as Putin desperately attempts to control the narrative. Russia's leader is heading the contradiction. On June 21st, the Kyiv Independent reported on comments made at the forum when he was quizzed about what economic experts were saying. Quoting American author Mark Twain, Putin said, "Rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated," when referring to Russia's economy. His message stood in stark contrast to the others being sent at the forum. As Russia's financial experts all warned of a grim future ahead, Putin poo-pooed the entire idea. "Our most important task is to ensure the economy's transition to a balanced growth trajectory," Putin added. At the same time, some specialists and experts point to the risks of stagnation and even recession. This should not be allowed under any circumstances. Does Putin mean that a recession shouldn't be allowed to happen? Or is he saying that the experts shouldn't be allowed to talk about it? An expert on Russia's economy named Vasily Astrov also spoke to Newsweek about the mixed messages coming out of Russia. Astrov says that the issues of economic policy are one of the few areas in which Russia's leading minds have some freedom to engage in debate, which is why we're seeing contradicting opinions. However, he also notes the statements made by anybody regarding economic policy will always be tinged by whatever interests the person making those statements has. Party and organizational affiliation color the opinions being shared. There's still quite a lot of freedom in Russia when it comes to economic policy debates, the state of the economy, unlike in Erdogan's Turkey, for example, Astrov told Newsweek. So it's not surprising that there are different opinions expressed by various officials. What we seem to have here is a perfect example of Putin's denial. The experts surrounding him are all warning Putin that his war is sending Russia hurtling toward an economic wasteland. Rather than listening to them, Putin is sticking his fingers in his ears, ignoring the warnings and claiming that Russia's economy is still on a strong footing. And he has plenty of so-called evidence to back that opinion. In April 2025, Russia raised its economic growth figure for 2024 to 4.3% from its previous 4.1%. That might be enough for Putin to assume his country's economy is doing well. After all, growth is good. On the surface, the 4.3% figure seems to showcase an economy that's heading in the right direction, driven by Putin's war, so why should Russia's leader listen to all of the naysayers? If the current policies worked in 2024, they would work in 2025, he seems to believe. What Putin is ignoring, willfully or otherwise, is that Russia's strong 2024 economic growth is an illusion. Driven by the military-industrial complex Putin has created since he invaded Ukraine, that growth draws a curtain over a myriad of economic problems the Ukraine war has created. Now that curtain is being pushed back, and we're starting to see the many cracks in the foundations of Putin's economic policy that are leading Russia to its doom. Russia's financial problems run deep. And they're all caused by Putin's war started in February 2022. The first sign of economic stress that Putin is trying to ignore comes from Russia's National Wealth Fund. Funded primarily by income from gas and oil sales, along with other key Russian investments, that fund is essentially a collection of liquid assets Russia can access quickly whenever they're needed. Think of the fund as a buffer. During times of economic instability, such as those caused by the Ukraine war, Russia can use this fund to buffer its federal budget, according to Trading Economics. Putin's problem is that the National Wealth Fund is starting to run dry. On June 4th, the Kyiv Insider reported that month saw Putin once again rely far too heavily on the ever-depleting assets in that fund. He spent $4 billion of the fund on his war effort, leaving a paltry $36.1 billion. This spending included the sale of 29 tons of gold the fund held, leaving just 139 tons in its stockpile. Putin also sold off 11 billion Chinese yuan, meaning the fund now has 153 billion yuan remaining. For context, the National Wealth Fund contained around $140 billion when Putin started the Ukraine war. This latest expenditure means that Putin has burned through a little over $100 billion of the liquid reserves Russia has available. Bear in mind that those reserves are supposed to be replenished by Russia's oil and gas sales as well as its investments. In other words, money has been coming into the fund as Putin has been spending, meaning the real figure is likely to be even higher than $100 billion. United 24 Media points out that Russia has been using its National Wealth Fund to offset its budget deficit in the years since Putin invaded Ukraine. As of July 3rd, the fund has been depleted by 68%, and there are no signs that Putin is going to stop spending anytime soon. It gets worse. Another problem with the National Wealth Fund, as it stands right now, is its composition. Velocity points out in a YouTube video covering Russia's budding financial crisis, stating, an even more troubling story for Moscow, the National Wealth Fund has shifted from 45% US dollars and euros in 2021 to 60% Chinese yuan and 20% gold today. That's a problem for several reasons. First, it shows that Russia is increasingly reliant on Chinese currency to stock up its National Wealth Fund, demonstrating just how isolated it's become from the West. Dollars and euros are almost worthless to Russia now thanks to the crushing weight of Western sanctions. Second, as Velocity points out, gold and yuan are less liquid than the currencies that made up the fund in the past. They can still be converted into rubles, but the systems for doing so are slower than those for the US dollar, in particular, meaning Russia has to wait a little longer to get its hands on cash. Or as the Kyiv Insider puts it, the visual trajectory of the NWF, or National Wealth Fund, confirms the broader trend. As ruble-denominated non-liquid assets rise, dollar-based liquidity collapses. What remains is a reserve fund in name only, one whose solvency depends not on market value, but on the state's willingness to keep revaluing failed assets at par. So, Russia's liquid reserves are running dry. That alone might not be a recession-causing problem. However, this depletion is accompanied by several other economic factors that are plaguing Russia, which include the country's rampant military spending. War against Ukraine doesn't come cheap. The head of Ukraine's military intelligence, Kirill Budanov, made that clear in February when he claimed that Russia was spending about $1 billion per day on its invasion. This is an extremely expensive war. A day of war costs slightly less than $1 billion for them. This is a huge amount of money, Budanov said. 41% of budget expenditures is the defense budget. These are abnormal figures. To implement this budget, almost all social programs, medical, educational were curtailed. Already that's bad news for Russia's people. Budanov is pointing out that Putin is so hell-bent on completing his invasion that he's sacrificing the services that are supposed to be taking care of his people. And again, he keeps on spending. In September 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia will hike its defense spending by 25% in 2025, raising its outgoings to $145 billion for the year. That means defense accounts for 32% of its budget expenditures. This contradicts Budanov's figures, though it's also worth pointing out that the 25% announcement came from Russia itself. That means it might just be the amount Putin is willing to admit to spending. Budanov seems to be claiming that Russia is spending far more than it claims. Around the same time that Budanov made his comments, Politico reported that Russia's military expenditure has risen so fast that it's now outspending all European countries. Collectively, Europe spent $457 billion on defense in 2024. That would seem to put Russia far behind on the spending front. However, when Russia's military spending is calculated in terms of purchasing power parity, or PPP, the picture looks much different. PPP allows for recalculations based on what a country receives for the money it spends, with Russia generally spending less for the same type of equipment than a European country. When adjusted for PPP, Russia's defense budget is actually $461.6 billion, Politico says. Either way, it's clear that Putin is pouring too much money into Russia's military, which is contributing to the country's economic problems. And Russia's leader at least seems capable of admitting that fact. On June 27th, just a few days after the forum where Russia's economic experts delivered their warning to Putin, Russia's leader announced that he will be cutting defense expenditure. Next year and the year after, over the next 3-year period. Putin tried to frame this decision as a sign that Russia isn't preparing for aggressive action elsewhere in Europe, pointing to increases in NATO-aligned countries' expenditure as a sign that it's the West that's causing all of the problems. In reality, this decision is an admission from Putin that his experts are probably right. It's also a half measure that isn't going to do anywhere near enough to cure his country's economic woes. Another factor that's caused the call for an end to the Ukraine war is Russia's terrible inflation and interest rate situation. On June 6th, Russia's central bank announced that it was dropping Russia's base interest rate by 100 points. That would be good news were it not for the fact that Russia's rate was 21% when the announcement was made. Now it's 20%. A still sky-high rate that makes it much more difficult for Russian people to borrow money, fund investments, or build businesses. Compounding this interest rate problem is Russia's inflation. That's been rising constantly over the last year, with February 2025 bringing with it a 2-year high that saw inflation in Russia jump to over 10%, hitting 10.1% year-on-year. It only got worse from there, at least for a couple of months, as Russia's inflation hit 10.3% in March and 10.2% in April. It finally dropped back below the 10% barrier in May, though only just. Inflation was 9.9% during that month. So not only do the Russian people have to deal with the misery that comes with having limited access to loans and other forms of interest-based financing, but they're paying more for products than they should be. Russia's massive inflation is affecting everything from food to energy prices, leading to a lower standard of living for the average Russian. And again, Putin's war is the cause. His focus on the military-industrial complex he's created, combined with the sanctions placed against Russia by the West, have contributed to this combined inflation and interest rate chaos with which Russia is dealing. Somehow it gets even worse than that. There's also Russia's budget deficit to consider. On June 10th, AA reported that Russia had posted a 3.4 trillion ruble budget deficit for the first 5 months of 2025. That amounts to about $43.2 billion, and it's happening even as Russia's budget revenues rose by 3.1% during the 5-month period. The problem once again comes down to Putin's spending. Despite bringing in more money compared to the first 5 months of 2024, Russia is also spending a ton more. Budget expenditures climbed to 20.7% during the same period, meaning Russia's budget deficit now amounts to 1.5% of the country's entire gross domestic product. Why is this a bad thing? Well, a budget deficit occurs when a country's expenses exceed the revenue it's generating. In other words, Russia is spending more than it has, and it's likely placing itself deeper and deeper into the pockets of its creditors to do so. The two solutions to a budget deficit are to either increase revenue-generating activity, which is tough given the sanctions placed on Russia, or cut back on expenditures. Russia has already been doing plenty of the latter, as Budanov explained when talking about how much Putin spends on the Ukraine war. Putin himself has suggested that he'll be making cuts to Russia's defense budget. Budget deficits also cause problems with interest rates, causing them to go higher and can lead to increased levels of borrowing by a country, as well as low investment in that country. Russia is stuck in a painful cycle. Putin's war caused the budget deficit, with a litany of other problems resulting from that war, making it practically impossible for Russia to claw its way back out. At least, it can't fix the deficit problem until the war ends. That brings us right back to Russia's economists and their calls for Putin to end the Ukraine war. They recognize what Putin is trying to hide. Russia is in an extremely weak position right now. As Velocity explains, Russian business leaders who remained in the country are complaining about economic mismanagement and growing stagnation. Russia's pivot toward China and the global south hasn't provided the economic lifeline Putin promised. Attempts to circumvent Western sanctions, which have played a key role in causing economic issues, are no longer working. Russia built a shadow fleet and increased trade with China, both of which put a band-aid over the gaping economic wound the West's sanctions caused, at least for a little while. These workarounds demonstrate how sanctions have forced Russia into less efficient and more costly trade agreements, Velocity adds. Russia is caught in a loop. The West isn't going to ease up soon. The European Union is currently pushing for an 18th sanctions package, which has only been held up because Hungary and Slovakia objected. As soon as that package passes, more pressure gets heaped on Russia. The only way to drive revenue into Russia is the shadow fleet and trade with China, both of which are becoming progressively less active while leaving Russia beholden to Beijing. And all the while, the Russian economy crumbles around Putin. That's why so many financial experts in Russia are calling for an end to the war. The question now is simple: will that end come? It's not looking good for Russia's economists. On July 3rd, Al Jazeera reported on a recent phone call between Putin and US President Donald Trump. The Trump administration's goal was to use this call to restart ceasefire negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. It failed. Putin reiterated that he won't end the war unless the root causes of the Ukraine crisis are solved. That root cause is Putin's belief that Ukraine shouldn't exist as a sovereign nation and that it should instead be a Russian vassal state. Nothing less than complete capitulation will do for Putin. Trump expressed frustration after the call, with Al Jazeera reporting that he said he was not happy and that the call made no progress on Putin moving closer to a ceasefire. The Trump administration may finally be realizing that the entire Ukraine war comes down to one man and his unshakable opinion about what Ukraine is supposed to be. And that's the problem Russia faces right now. Putin's authoritarianism has taken him this far with little in the way of resistance from his people. But now the Ukraine war is threatening to ruin Russia's economy. It's already come close to doing so, as Putin's few-day special military operation has evolved into a multi-year war of attrition that's draining Russia's resources. Putin has spent far more than he ever intended on this war, but his ideology hasn't been shaken. He doesn't want to be seen to end the war based on how it stands right now. Whether through negotiation or direct action, he wants to destroy Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine will never agree to that, leaving the continuation of the fight as Putin's only option. It doesn't matter if Russia's central bank is begging Putin to end the war. It also doesn't matter just how deep into the doldrums Putin plunges his country's economy. He has a goal. He won't be deterred from that goal. If nothing can change his mind, Putin is going to lead Russia into the abyss of economic destruction sooner rather than later. And all of this is happening as Putin launched a summer offensive that is far less successful than he hoped it would be. Even more money is being burned as that offensive collapses, causing Russia's momentum to slip at the worst possible time. Find out more in our video that uncovers the truth behind Russia's summer offensive, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more commentary on the crumbling state of Russia's economy.